Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to our book launch this evening. Thank you all for being here. We are, of course, here to launch Paul Batchelor's new collection, The Acts of Oblivion. So thanks for joining us this evening. We're joined by Paul. He is here and he's going to join us shortly. We're also joined by John McAuliffe, who is Professor of Poetry at the University of Manchester, and he's also, of course, Associate Publisher and Editor here with us at Carcanet Press. So he's going to be on screen in just a moment, and I'll be talking to Paul later on. But before I hand over to them, just to let you know what's going to go on tonight. Excuse me. Now, I can see that some of you have found the chat. Please all do find the chat box. We can't see your faces this evening, so please pop your messages in there and let us know where you're listening from and what you think of the reading. When you're using the chat, please do make sure that you click on everyone, not just hosts and panelists, so that everyone can see each other's messages and get involved in the conversation. Later on in the event, we want you to be involved again in the conversation. There's another button which says Q&A. It's different from the chat. While John and Paul are talking about the book, there'll be some time for John to put your questions to Paul. So if you get those lined up in the Q&A box, he'll be able to read them out to him later on. And the final thing for me to tell you is that during Paul's reading, I'm going to have the text on screen as a sort of visual aid. If it's not kind of right for you, if you need Paul's video to be bigger or anything like that, just have a play around with it and you should be able to reconfigure it. If you've got any problems, technical or otherwise, in the event, just pop them in the chat box and we'll do our best to help you throughout the event. So I think that's everything from me. I'm going to ask John to join me on screen and we'll begin the book launch.
Thanks, Jazz, and hello everybody. I'm really delighted to be introducing Paul's wonderful book, The Acts of Oblivion, tonight. I've got quite a couple of paragraphs about Paul's work, which I'm going to read out to you as a setting for it, and then I'm really looking forward to hearing Paul speak. Paul Batchelor's previous publication as a poet, The Love Darg, was in one respect almost a secret. It was a pamphlet published by the excellent fine press Clutag, its date of publication given as New Year's Day 2014. I remember reading it and talking about a few of the poems in it with a number of people that spring, and it turned out they had all read it too. It wasn't much of a secret. It's not often that a pamphlet becomes a public event like that, reviewed in The Guardian and widely talked about. This one, though, did. It was the work of a mature poet who was also writing reviews that were really kind of changing the weather for British poetry. Reviews that were simultaneously learned, penetrating, and sheerly entertaining. But we were not reading Paul's pamphlet out of gratitude for his doing the public service job of reviewing with such elan. We had all of us been reading his poems in magazines, which fed an appetite and curiosity to see what he was doing. After The Love Darg, further remarkable poems began to appear, poems which each of them seemed to me to be masterpieces, in the old sense of that word, whereby a piece of work by a craftsman is accepted as qualification for membership of a guild as an acknowledged master. But what is strange about Paul's masterpieces only became clear when I read back through the contents page of this new book. Paul's only his second full book of poems, which includes a couple of handfuls of poems from The Love Darg and is finally, belatedly among us. It is some yield, masterpieces included from this past decade and more of writing. Now, I'd like to say something as well about what it is I think that makes Paul's writing so distinct. I can't think of another writer with such a strong sense of what might be at stake, what could be and what is at stake in his poems. It can be sometimes agonizing to feel the weight in the lines of these poems. There are poems here whose mysterious riddles and parables are as gripping as accusing, poems which matter as they lay out their cases for and against what they have witnessed. Then there is the idea that Paul's poems in this book come at you not like a flock of pigeons or as repeated iterations of a singular house style or in a voice responding to occasions. Instead, readers will meet surprise after surprise, translations, autobiography, a series of historical fictions, dramatic monologues, which I have relished reading and rereading, the unclassifiably wonderful A Form of Words, one of the great poems of the past decade, which we're going to hear tonight. This is a book which contains not one masterpiece or one kind of masterpiece, but a whole range of them, though I do think they have one thing in common. It's what I most value in the poems, and that's Paul's pure instinct for the margins, where he can look back at us and find voices and forms and tones which throw into relief our moment and remind us that there have been and will be other voices, and that poems can still be places where, and I hope you'll excuse my using this much quoted phrase, places where thought might grow. So I'll hand over to Paul to read from the Acts of Oblivion. Oh, can't hear you, Paul.
Oh, no. That's the first time I've done that. Okay, you should be able to hear me now. And yeah, all those Zoom meetings, I was never the person who did that. Anyway, thank you, John, for that amazing introduction. It's very kind of you. Thank you to everyone who's come to this event. I'm just going to get straight into the poems. I'm going to start with a poem called The Curlew. And this is about, well, the occasion of the poem is falling asleep on a train that is stopped and having a sort of waking dream. So the syntax goes a bit dreamy in the middle, and hopefully you get a bit lost. And if that happens, it's okay. The Curlew. Sighs and groans. As it crawls to a standstill, the train becomes a fortress. Outside, pitiless silence, emptied sky, snowbound farms, ever deepening blue. The vulnerable economies of owl and fox. Fields brushed as by a comet's tail with winter. No announcement, no sign of the guard. We have reached the threshold. It is everywhere at once, in depthless white drifts, unbroken to the world's rim. Every man's harvest. I close my eyes. An automated voice declares a range of light snacks is available. It's airless, scumfish as the hide at Clara Vale, the Primus stove, the stash of second earlies. And who is this, if not mine own George Fox? For by his leathern trews I know him, twirling the logbook on its string, actual, talked up, talking in lines skimmed from his Penguin Classics journal where it rests in my hands. I had forsaken all the priests, for there was none that spoke to my condition. The world seemed but a briery wilderness, beset with men's inventions. Windy doctrines blowed folk about, now this way and now that, from sect to sect. Oh, here were wells without water. Here was the cloud without rain. From Clara Vale to Furbank Fell, Dirt Pot to Sparty Lee, my dream tour of hilltop outposts where Quakers and hair-eyed Methodists dug in for the love of clarity, high on the law, and the promise of salvation, abstracted in varieties of silence above all. Friendly people who would not come into no great towns, but lived in the fells like butterflies, numbering sins clean as tumblestones, finding fences where others saw open fields, their inward light a sullen joy in sun-slashed verticals, Irish weather driving across the uplands, and the rained-out curlew sob that might have been a true saying, be as a stranger unto all. Okay, so that poem is kind of about a dream encounter with George Fox, the founder of the Quakers. And the closing words there are a quote from, that's what God said to George Fox when God visited him when George was a little boy, to not be a respecter of persons. And George obliged and was notoriously rude from then on. And I've written a sort of sequence of poems set in the 17th century, and I'll read from another of those. And this one is from a poem called The Rogue, and it's spoken by an actual historical figure called Henry Martin, who was one of the regicides. He signed the death warrant of Charles I, and was a really interesting and very radical figure with links to the Levellers and to a kind of a more radical revolution that didn't in the end happen because it became more Cromwell's revolution. And my poem takes the form of two letters. The first to his brother, and I've invented a kind of sibling rivalry there in order to convey his kind of angry, bristly side. And the second is a letter to the woman he loved all of his life. Technically, she was his mistress, but he wrote her many letters from prison. And some of these lines are based on phrases from those letters. And this is how the poem closes in any case. I'll just read from about 2/3 of the way down. Now, I gave the bearer monies to buy a neck of mutton, £2 of candles, 1 of rush, a 6-penny loaf, some beer and asparagus and coals, and left for you a token in the belly of my letter. I hope to send thee soon a bottle of rare sack, but thou must keep it cool in water with saltpeter. Meantime, look upon my brats. Is not thy dear among them? For has not one of them his face, or has not one his brains, or else his mirth? Look most upon that last, for it is just the best thing in the world, a thing never yet taken from me. According to Lucian, having reached the banks of Acheron, our soul will be stripped of character. All we would freely own, humility, patience, wit, and all we would overlook, pride's delicacy, would slow us. Our ponderous hypocrisy, unbalance Charon's skiff. Pity, real or feigned, would implicate us in the suffering of others and blind us to our own. So it is the fop must lose his vanity, the athlete all his prized perfections. At least, so Lucian says, and very like, for here in this life, as you see, we must divest ourselves of all that we possess. First, all that we can spare, and then all that remains. We exercise our will in ordering our losses, very like and proper to afterwards be stripped of the passions that possess us. Well, well, I will spend no more ink upon thee now, but bottle up my business for thy ugly ears. Therefore, good morrow, monkey face, thine own H. Martin. And I love this character. He really was a character that came through in the documents that we have, and especially in those letters written from various prisons after Charles II was on the throne. And he somehow managed to avoid being executed despite having signed the death warrant. He's one of the only regicides that wasn't bumped off by Charles II. He seems to have just either styled it out or been too notoriously dissolute a character to have been kind of worthy of sacrifice. Okay, I'm going to move on to a very different sort of poem. Okay, that one. I thought it was going to be a different one. This is from Brother Cole, which is a sequence in sort of 10 parts, which addresses Cole as a kind of imaginary friend, as as it sort of was in my childhood. It was there, and then it suddenly wasn't there anymore and wasn't really spoken of. And I think this poem is really about the impulse to lay claim to certain kinds of heritage, while being aware that you're not really cut out for that kind of work or that kind of heritage. So you make a very odd fit. I'll just read a few sections from this. I'm going to start with part 6. Fibered, veined, fissured like an icicle, black pleated muscle ripped with black blood crystal. It stranged my mind that I could never lift a shovelful or lug a sack, the heft, so much unmanageable worldliness overmatching me. And yet a single piece felt buoyant, quick, and easily borne. Before such mysteries, I hunkered down in contemplation. I turn and burn in claustral darkness. I found a church of one. And you turn too. You dream on, bide and deepen. While forests rise and fall, you wait to happen. And then you begin to slip from hand to hand, bestowing crumbs of soot, a never spent fortune, passing down intact through generations, from the men you wrecked to the sons raised in their image, all of them joined in dream reunions underground by the scab who turns, cribbed in the sweat of his bed, to face the wall and visit the land of Nod. I think I'm going to leave that there and move on. This is a there are all sorts of reasons, I suppose, to write a poem, and this one is about the worst person I've ever met. And I want you to feel free, though, to imagine it's about the worst person you've ever met. Might be the same guy. This is called The Well. So what? He told a lie. So what? It explained a thing or two about a thing or two. It wasn't anything that somebody else would never do. A little one. So what? There's a well. He put it at the heart of things. It just seemed to go right to the heart of things. It seemed right, or just to sing from the heart or something. There's a well in this world. He told a lie. He wore it like a mask. He worked at it, and later it worked him. A little one, the first. Don't ask. It worked. Of course it worked. Don't ask. Don't ask. There's a well in this world. Should you drink from it, your thirst will be worse than a curse. There's a well. Oh, but it's better not to think of it. You'll have to tell your friends. They'll thank you for it. He drank, if you can call it a well. And now for something even, possibly even more bitter. I'm going to read this poem for the first and I think the last time. This is called A Form of Words. The poem is clearly about things that can or cannot be said, things that are acceptable or unacceptable to hear spoken aloud. And there is one word. I'm not going to voice. The poem includes a racial slur, which is a quotation, but I'm not going to voice that. It's on the page. It'll be on the screen. A form of words. Just as after the affair, when I knew I was in the clear, but came down with trismus of all things, and had needs must to post the finest sashimi in Brooklyn through the half-inch letterbox between my upper and my lower incisors, poking it in there with the chopsticks, yearning to contribute in a non-confrontational way to Miss X and her sister's awful husband's conversazione on bluefin versus yellowfin, and then the whole environmental thing, this from a cunt who ate a turtle in Indonesia. I was saying nothing. I'm saying nothing now. And if I had to do it all again, I wouldn't. John Berryman said that. I'm not saying it. And just as when those two blokes came to replace the boiler and asked, would I like to pay cash? And I said, knee probs, and watched them carry gear in from the obligatory once white van and watched them work, and saw how, though both young, the elder laboured to the younger. But as they worked in brotherly quiet, an hour passed before I realised the older lad was touched, as I was taught to say, and how I liked the way the younger never loaded it. How, even when the elder put the radiator back before the skirting board or tripped over the blowtorch he'd left lying, no remonstrations followed. A ticking off over bait in the van, perhaps, but still 100 unregarded acts of kindness daily and of a gentleness conspicuously absent in certain other unacknowledged legislators. I can't say I object to what is being proposed. And that we must learn to leave the table when love is no longer being served. Charles Aznavour said that, I'm not saying it. And while I'm not saying a form of words couldn't be found, I still think of them two blokes, e.g. in boards of study at the Russell Group institution where I am currently on probation, as I bask in the glare of my colleagues' world-alienating pedantry. Yes, I sit like Caesar in his tent where the maps are spread, and I think of them two blokes. And it's like a hole in my head, and I think of them two blokes, or else I meditate on what it means to take your first full-time job at the age of 37, or on the nature of failure generally. When you arrive at the very bottom, you will hear knocking from below. Thanks, Stanislav Jerzylek. And just as when I am getting through the drinks that follow the interminable board of study at the Russell Group institution where I am currently on probation, and the ego chutneys coming down like hail, what I would say to inner city blacks is hip-hop is the problem, not the solution. I saw your TLS piece on Basil Bunting, and I have to say 14 isn't 12. Of course, the thing you mustn't say is Islam is truly evil. I might see if a form of words can't be found for the time in Brooklyn when Miss X accidentally locked us out of the apartment we'd been renting that last morning while the taxi purred and we panicked. And there was 15 feet of pure white snow and it was 6 a.m. and the landlord wasn't answering and the gods were asleep. And we were like, so do we call the cops or something? And eventually I just kicked the door in, and really it gave so easily. I can't say I shouldn't have done it sooner. And we grabbed our cases and caught the taxi after all, which meant we'd make the flight, and ported through wintry pre-dawn streets, hearing Jay-Z and Alicia Keys on the radio at that very moment sing what had hitherto seemed a gormless knees above a song about Manhattan's ability to confer a non-specific sense of optimism on the visitor. I felt imbued with possibly dubious agency. I now suspect my silences contain the best of me. And I'm a man who likes talking to a man who likes to talk. I never said that, Sydney Greenstreet said it. And even now, a form of words can surely be found for my feelings when packing up to move on from one shitty rental to another shittier rental, as I have done on an annual basis since the age of 18. I found the watch I'd lost the day we moved in behind a box of books, where it had lain 6 months pressed to the damp wall, so the leather strap had furred into a caterpillar with spiny hairs of mould, and when I fished it up by its buckle, I could hear the timepiece ticking on oblivious. Omissions are not accidents. Marianne Moore, you knew that one. And surely at this stage in the game, surely we can speak of Shorty, booted out first thing, early bird breakfasting on a fun-sized Mars bar, or trailing home through puddles dry-eyed, indifferent as the weather. Surely it's time to share our knowing he'd been interfered with, if not by his mum, a single mother, you can smell it on her breath, then by one or other of her men. We'd see them at the gates, all the cars Shorty got a going. We said out at the time, the foremost lesson of that fucking circus driven home when Miss Bird, newly in post, soon to fly south, asked what we'd like to be when we grew up. On his turn, Shorty sniggered, a rapist, and everyone cracked up. He'd got life, been expelled, before the bell went, class. Drank so much gin and whiskey, sweet mama, I can hardly talk. That's not me, that's blind Willie McTell. And might it now be possible to try your patience further? I said, may I be permitted, reader, majesty, to tax your patience further and find a form of words for how it felt to see, after the bailiffs had fucked off with a truckload of furniture, indoor slides for the bands, the Xbox microwave deep fat fryer, IKEA light fittings fancied up with glitter glue, widescreen plasma telly on tick, the sandwich toaster he must have won at the Hoppings, and even, get this, her cross trainer, after they'd been turfed out too, him not all there, touched. Her pregnant a month to Christmas, my neighbours across the way's landlord stopping by for a poke about. He even brought a flask of tea so he could make an afternoon of it. And can I hope to improve on the form of words he later found for his complaint that having acquired so much tat, he'd have to rent the place as furnished next time round, which was frankly a pain in the balls, or else offload the junk somehow or other, though he'd get nothing for it because nothing was worth anything these days. Your silence will not protect you, Audrey Lord. I only appropriate what you were saying. And surely one day soonish there will be seasoned you, to speak of old Ray next door, who'd stop by now and then for a bit moan about the number of on the bus, or the number of tracksuits queuing for heroin and boots, or the milk from the co-op being radioactive and Polish, or just to count the bottles in my recycling bin, old Ray, to whom I spoke as little as possible, disliking utterly and without reserve his manner, opinions, face and smell. And then after the stroke, his maimed voice seeping through the wall as he chewed the ear off his daughter-in-law, who must have jealoused old Ray, had monies squirreled away, a base mope like farting in the bath, as though no form of words could be found. Oh, pray for me, Saint Sasha, in fluent Ruski, or via your unusually expressive eyebrows. When you remove the bone, as one might draw a hairpin, smear the roll-mop on black bread, and indulge my little pretense that the Russian deli at Elephant and Castle is St. Petersburg. Oh, pray for me, St. Edwin, with all the fervency the envious angels will allow. When picked out on the dripping verges, I feel against my cheek the blousy petals of the rhododendron. Oh, pray for me, St. Effie. Walk with me under the viaduct to Flass Vale, where goldfinches chivvy up and off across the way. Teach me to live the hours, not the years, and do please to my dizzy, boring, venlafaxine thinking what Oz's whistling once did to Sunday afternoons. Oh, pray for me, St. Jeff, from the snowball fight with Kiyonaga to the mountains of Hiroshima. I am with you on the bridge in spirit, under the fox's bridal procession. And when you say so, we'll stare down, see only the sun at the ripples, the glint of light, a sugared glaze. For without you, I am Cobra Verde, and I never had a friend in my life. O patron of the honest overlooked, Saint Bob, gentle man with Border Reaver blood in your veins, when you are beachcombing Boaties Bay for sea glass, washed up from the abandoned works, mermaid's tears, fish eyes from punty rods, frosted pearls and end-of-day glass. Pray for me now, I am becoming part of the immense indifference of the world. Thank you for listening, if indeed you are still there.
Thank you, Paul. Really, really wonderful. What a great treat to hear that absolutely amazing poem come out in one long spiel. Great to hear it. So, Paul, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about this poem, and then maybe a couple of other things. And there might be things you'd like to talk about as well. But there's a lot of chat going on in the chat there as well. And I'm going to ask everybody who might have a question for Paul yourselves, just to drop that in the Q&A box, and I'll be keeping an eye on that, and there'll be time as well for you to ask questions of Paul. So, Paul, last night I was listening to Newsnight with unusual relish, knowing what they were going to be talking about. And the phrase that Emily Maitlis kept on using was, the government hasn't it found a form of words, you know? And I was thinking to myself, Paul Batchelor is writing the news. So I wanted to ask you about political speech and poetry. And about, because your poems really are thinking about language now, and how it is used. And the poems are at an angle to that. And this poem has that in mind, even with the word you can't use out loud, even to voice it in another character's voice. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about forms of words and politics and poetry, just for a minute.
Just for a minute, in 10 words. Yeah, I mean, the phrase "a form of words" is one you'll have heard a lot, probably in university, because it's a kind of management speak that gets into sort of university talk in boards of study. And I just thought it was so, it seemed to be becoming ubiquitous, and I thought it was so funny, this sort of description of a thing, but being the thing as well, and it working as a little definition of a poem, which is just a form made of words. And I thought it is a poem, a terrible, terrible poem. And I think I found that, well, one of the sources of it, I haven't checked in a dictionary, but is one of the sources is Great Expectations, when Pip is finally declares his love to Estella. And I should have prepared this. And he sort of declares his love finally, and she looks at him and says, when you say you love me, I know what you mean as a form of words. It kind of explains how there's absolutely nothing there. There's no feeling whatsoever. So, that's not answering your question at all. But...
Well, maybe I can approach it another way, Paul, as well, which is you begin with a word which I had to go to the dictionary for, which is trismus, a beautiful word for lockjaw, and this sense that people, you can't speak of things, and about how impossible it is, how words fail us, maybe, and trying to find a form of words which won't fail us.
Yeah. No, and that kind of management speak or political speak, it's usually, it's in the place, it's when something unspeakable has happened, an illegal party or something outrageous in academia has happened, and you hear people say, we shall have to find a form of words to explain this to the students or something. So it's a kind of tag for the unspeakable.
No, it's great, and it just powers up the poem about what can and can't be said, and of course you make us up as the people to whom things can be said, and we are so relieved that we can be spoken to like this. Or that's how I think many of us feel when we read a poem or read this poem. One of the things that also struck me is the prayer, the way you end with prayer, I guess, and I know you're addressing particular saints, and there are ironies in there too, but there's a heartfelt kind of, there's something I hadn't, I suppose, noticed, why would I have, or maybe I should have, is how religious figures come into the poems, and the curlew and George Fox's faith, which allows him to leave the crowd and follow his own way. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about religious language and how that fits in the poems in this book.
Yeah, it sort of crept in without me knowing, and after A Form of Words was published, it was a poet called Catherine Simmons who has faith and just wrote and said that she'd liked the poem, and it was a religious poem. She just sort of stated it, and I realized that it sort of was, and that's how she had been reading it. And so we had a little talk about that, and it seems an entirely legitimate way to read the poem. And I think for me personally, faith is just something that I keep I don't even know if you could say wanting to attempt and seeming incapable of it. And one of the interesting things about the 17th century is just the sheer the extent to which the world was turned upside down, which was a phrase often used in the Civil War days. And religious assumptions and perspectives were also turned upside down, and new ways of understanding Christianity were sort of opened up as well at that time. And I think that was part of what really interested me about that period.
Yeah, I might ask you, Paul, because I think it's fascinating, but the title of the book, I wondered if you could tell, because again, the 17th century is at the heart of the book, and your book's title sets up ideas which then reverberate through the entire different kinds of poems. But could you tell us what the Acts of Oblivion were?
Yeah, so the first one of this period that I'm aware of came after Henry Martin talked in the House of Commons and about maybe we'd be better off without a king, and he sort of tabled it for discussion, and it was discussed. And this led to, as the discussion went on over the coming days and weeks, it led to so much unease about how radical the politics was becoming. They decided to, well, first of all, he was thrown out and he wasn't allowed to be an MP, and he was sort of exiled to his seat. And he was put in jail briefly and then exiled. So he wasn't an MP anymore. But so the cat was out the bag and everyone was talking about this. So they decided to pass an Act of Oblivion and just collectively pretend it had never been talked about. And it was struck from the official record. And but what that meant was, since it had never been talked about, Henry Martin hadn't done anything wrong. And no one was allowed to remember what he'd said. So he came back as an MP and continued his sort of bizarre, radical career. And after Charles II was back on the throne, there was another Act of Oblivion to officially forgive the regicides and others for what they'd done, which was a really an even more false Act of Oblivion, because they were sort of quietly assassinated. Most of them were, and there were all kinds of retribution. So there's forgetting, there's forgetting.
And
I just like that kind of that time when the official record was, I mean, any official record's always at variance from anyone's experience of a thing, but it's such an interesting time that it's so massively at variance. Yeah.
And could you say something about why you decided this is going to be the title of the book? Because of course it fits in with the 17th century, but when did you know that this was, and did it encourage you to write other poems, or?
I think I was stuck for a title for a very long time. You can't, I couldn't actually bring myself to call it something more jokey. It was Geordie Leviathan for quite a while, but you can't really, it's mis-selling the book. It's not as fun as that makes it sound. But no, it's really grand and kind of pretentious and hilarious.
So it was his hilarious pretentiousness which made you decide to title the book.
I called my first book The Sinking Road, which is who does that?
Very good. So now you've mentioned the Northeast, and I guess I do want you to talk a little bit about place and about how central that sense of yourself as being a poet from a place is to the poems, or maybe it isn't. But there's a lot in terms of the place names and in terms of the history that you draw into the book, and which I loved. But
yeah, I mean, I guess everyone has mixed feelings about where they come from, and that's mixed feelings make for good poems. And I came to really love a few poets from this part of the world, like Basil Bunting and Barry McSweeney, who in very different ways kind of wrote about this area and the places and mapped it out. And so I think it's as much that kind of literary Northumberland is where I live, as well as literally Northumberland. And I think they both, something I liked about both poets, although they're very different, they had this kind of really open, Northumberland was kind of extendable to encompass anything they liked could be kind of claimed as Northumbrian, but it wasn't done in a kind of po-faced way. It was done, I think, a little tongue-in-cheek, and there's a lovely, I don't know, I like that idea of it being this stretchy, synthetic kind of Northumberland.
So we're all living in Greater Northumbria, yeah?
Yeah, when I say so, yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
like I thought the Irish weather was cheeky myself. That split it across the curlew. So I wonder, the other thing I suppose is we heard from Henry Martin, but there are a number of other kind of figures whose voices you take on, and so we have Matthew Hopkins and we have John Ruskin, and so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what drove you into the dramatic monologue, and what it allows you to do.
Yeah, I mean, I based there's a poem called The Discoverer's Man, which is sort of based on Matthew Hopkins, but not strictly speaking about him. So I've changed, I've sort of just deliberately scrambled names and dates in order to make it clear that they're based on certain people and certain events, but clearly not that as well. It just seemed to need that kind of freedom, and I think he's I suppose there are lyric poems in the book which are about kind of the difficulty of speaking for yourself, and then that at a certain point that can quite easily become the idea of writing a mask poem or a persona poem. I think they're all the different, the dramatic monologues are at different stages from sort of Robert Browning-esque to maybe F.T. Prince or someone like that, whose work I really love. Where there's just different ways of trying to capture a voice and a kind of part mask, part persona, part impersonation. Yeah, and then there's a very long poem spoken by Ruskin, but then a section of that's a translation of Pearl, of the medieval poem, and that just seemed such a perfect matchup. I thought Ruskin would have loved that, and he could just about conceivably have read it. It was sort of rediscovered just in time for him to read, and some of the pre-Raphaelites illustrated editions of it. But I just like the idea of Ruskin translating it for us.
Great. That's fantastic, Paul. And there's such relish in how you bring their language into the poem. Like it gives you opportunities, doesn't it? I think to kind of broaden the kind of the depths of language that you can go into for the poems too.
Yeah, that's part of the attraction, isn't it? Just you throw your voice out and you can sort of gather in all of these really interesting, beautiful words. I mean, Ruskin just wrote, I think, the most beautiful prose in English, and so part of it is just enjoying being able to let rip with that, and those enormous sentences. I do like a long sentence.
Very good. Well, I've got a couple of questions now, and if there are any others, do pop them in. Martin Malone. Martin has in Aberdeen, I'm thinking Martin maybe has a fantastic question for you. A small one really, Paul. Nature and a pantheon abhors a vacuum, he says. Now that he's gone, are we kitting you up to fill Geoffrey Hill's shoes?
Oh, Jesus.
And if we are, how do you feel about that?
That's terrifying. No, don't do that, Martin. Please. Oh my God. Martin, I thought you were going to ask me something about boxing. Ah. No, no, I love Geoffrey Hill's work. I mean, that is just a sort of felt absence, I suppose, for me in contemporary poetry. It feels though like any really good poet, he did sort of he wrote ahead of his own personal demise, and so you're always going to be playing catch up with him, and he literally was just remained interested in the language as it was developing, and just in his latest work, in his last works, was ever more sort of chasing the very present moment in such an interesting way, that it still feels very much with us in a way. It's a bit of a trite thing to say about Geoffrey Hill.
No, that's great. So the shoes are not to be filled yet. He's still in them, is what you're saying, Paul.
Yeah. Still in them.
Martin is going to come back with a boxing question in a minute, he says. And Ken Evans, Ken asks, and I guess this is a question just about what drives the writing, really. Do you think that what you described as bitterness in the brilliant poems gives you energy to enter into performing the poem? And is that a way that that kind of sense of anger can boost, the words and thought as you're as you're setting down to work?
I think it doesn't feel that way. It always feels like it's actually just quite a depleting thing to be angry about the state of the world, or politics, or the environment, or your workplace, or whatever. It's a really enervating, depleting thing, and it's depressing is how it actually feels. And I suppose trying to make that anger sort of soluble in poetry is really it takes me ages to do it, so any kind of catharsis seems to have evaporated. It takes too long for that. I wish it was as quick to write as it was to read, but then you'd feel this, I'm sure you'd feel this great relief, but no.
Very good. And a related question from Abby Garrington, who writes that the boiler lads in A Form of Words make me weep. Your writing is always righteous in its sense of where kindness is and where it isn't, but ought to be. And could you say something more about kindness in your work or in the work of others?
Oh, Abby's a colleague, so that's a really great question. I'll get you back for asking me a really great question later. How am I going to answer that? Oh, I suppose I'm, as a reviewer, I think I've been, I've sort of criticized people for writing sentimental poems and been probably called an unkind reviewer, an unkind person for saying that. And I suppose kindness and actual kinship and treating people in kind is of the highest importance. And I think the only way to try to get at that is through discarding the false, the fake forms of kindness, which I think sentimentality in art is one, and certain kinds of politeness, sort of masquerading as kindness, is another. And poems are, among other things, a place that you can kind of preserve such moments, and I thought the Boiler Lads was one. Obviously, it happened. Everything in the poem happened. As you know, yeah. So it was just a little sort of tribute to that human capacity. I feel like, yeah, it's something poems are all should be traveling towards or reaching towards.
Yeah.
Very
good.
Terrible answer to a really good question.
Great, thanks, Paul. And Simon Howard. Hi, Simon. Simon asks if you might say something about your combining different forms of English in the poems, older and newer in a historical sense, but also a striking mixture of vernacular and the profane with something much more cerebral. And if that's something that you're after in the poems, you know, as you're doing the slow work of making them.
Yeah, definitely. I think trying to kind of sound those notes from the extremes of the scale and just trying to open up that kind of space. And if you can do it right, doing it in quite a dynamic way, I was looking back through this once it had appeared as a book. I was struck by, I thought, I've got a very slow line as a rule. It seems incredibly slow. And I envy poets like Edmund Morgan or someone who has a really fast line. He was able to touch all of these notes on the scales in incredible speed. And it's not cluttered, it's just beautiful and graceful, perfect. And it takes me a bit longer, I think, just to peg out the tent around the field. But I think trying different registers of language is part of that. And if that reminds me, I want to say something about the word I didn't voice in the poem, a form of words. I hummed and hawed about whether to include it at all, but I kind of wanted it in to sort of rhyme with the middle class racism of hating on Islam, which is an acceptable form of racism in certain quarters, and to people who have no difficulty in accusing working class people of racism, but in fact, if that's just put into middle class terms, it becomes acceptable, and that was my justification. You shouldn't offer justifications, but there's one.
Very good. That's great. Well, Paul, I might finish. I wondered if I might ask you to read one more poem, because we've just got a couple of minutes left. I'd love to hear, these are rare, I haven't heard you read the poems in a long time.
I thought you...
What do you think?
Might be sick of them. The chat is full of comments that I dread to read, actually, but I want to try.
We'll leave the chat open for a couple of minutes afterwards, for a few minutes afterwards, for anybody who wants to add anything else in.
Yeah. But yeah. Well, you know what? I will read, since this will be the last poem. I'm going to read a poem called "Last Poem," and this is for Derek Mahon. It's in so this won't be on the screen, so I'll just show you what it looks like. This is going to be my claim to fame. I wrote lots. I read. Oh no, Jazz has got it. She's on the case. I wrote quite a few poems in this form of kind of skinny 14-line stanzas, 3 skinny 14-liners. You'll see them everywhere soon. Last poem. We value them, the voices that need us least, who speak with honest subtlety to ironies beyond us, who slip our grasp and go whistling down endless celestial colonnades of not astral planes where the dream soul wanders, but airport corridors, bus stations, the Gare du Nord, a beach house in Goa, testing posterity with promises to break. Who wouldn't picture you somewhere refurbishing your echo chamber stanzas, making Parnassus ring with the clattering of a battered Olympia, tricks of tone and scrambled rhyme schemes drawing dry-eyed epiphanies from Dionysian mysteries. If you didn't guard against such hopes with the nonchalance of complete despair, as against the sublime you almost perfectly renounced. All fade oblivionwards. That I can believe. Still, when our attitudes at last become us, and we threaten to stiffen into posture, if nothing else, your words may release us into gesture. Or so I tell myself, as I scribble these rough numbers and lay my little wreath. I got to meet you once and gave my name for silence and best wishes, Derek Mann. My life on earth remembers. And you know, Simon Hayworth asked a lovely question, so I'll just say that I think that in a way this poem started after he gave a really interesting paper that stuck in my mind, and at a conference, and it was the words gesture and posture had kept recurring in the discussion of Mahon, and it just, that half rhyme just stuck in my mind from that moment. And then when I heard that he died, I wrote this very quickly, and there it was. There was that little place for that half rhyme.
That's a lovely thing for us to store up as well, Paul. Paul, thank you very much. It's wonderful to hear the poems. This is as good a book as anybody could wish for. It's just a fantastic book of poems. I know that, you know, from all the great comments and notes that you have in the chat here, that I'm not alone in thinking that. And it's going to be around for a while, Paul. Thanks very much for reading for us tonight. And we'll be back next week. And I think Jazz might be able to tell us a little bit about what's coming up next. Good night, Paul. And good night, all.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you, Paul. It was amazing to hear you read from the book and to talk about it as well. So yeah, thank you so much and congratulations. And thanks to John as well for being such a great host. Thanks for being so vocal in the chat. It's been amazing to see your questions. I'll leave it open for a couple of minutes. I did put the link in there so that you can go and buy your copy of the book. Thank you obviously for paying your £2. You will get £2 off your copy if you use the discount code. It'll also come as an email tomorrow, so just wait until tomorrow if you can't do it right now, and the link and the discount and everything will be in there for you. If you have any problems, as usual, just get in touch with us and we'll be able to help you get your copy of the book. I should say that we're really sorry that we can't actually send books to the EU at the moment. We're really working hard to find a way to fix that. So if you are in the EU, you can get it through your local bookshop or maybe from another website which we shan't name. And if you are hoping to order books in the UK for Christmas, please make sure you get your orders in by December the 13th. Just we can't guarantee delivery after that date. So, okay, please join us again next week. It's our final launch of the year. We're launching Rowan Williams' collected poems, and he will be talking to Rachel Mann. So that's all on the website. You can find the information for that there. But that's everything for now. So thank you once again and congratulations to Paul, and we'll see you next week.